Hello and welcome to Unspun Live, the Herald's politics podcast. My name is Andrew Learmonth and I am the political editor of the paper. Over the past week, the Herald has been running a major series looking at Scotland's place in a changing world, Scotland's defence future. We've been talking about everything from shipbuilding on the Clyde, where they're turning out some of the most advanced warships in the world, to the growing threats on Europe's doorstep, to the question of how much this is going to cost and where that money is going to come from. To help us make sense of it all, I'm joined in this week's episode by two brilliant guests, both of whom contributed to the series. George Allison is the editor of the UK Defence Journal. He wrote a great piece on what he described as the Scottish shipbuilding renaissance, looking at everything from skills and jobs and exports. And David Pratt, the veteran foreign correspondent and Herald's contributing editor on foreign affairs, whose piece set out why we are living through perhaps the most volatile security environment since the Cold War. I started off by asking him if we should be worried.
Well, I think we should be worried. I think the world at the moment is facing a pretty precarious kind of landscape, generally speaking. And that's pretty much acknowledged, I think, in just about every government or think tank report that you come across right now. I mean, the obvious one, I mentioned in my article that the Global Peace Index report of 2025, if I can, I'll just quote you just a quick sentence here rather than going on about this. But the international order is approaching a tipping point where rising economic fragmentation, accelerating rearmament, multiple competing spheres of influence are creating the conditions for the onset of large-scale conflict and the associated economic destruction. And I think that kind of summary or synopsis is kind of borne out in just about every report that you read at the moment. I mean, we've got the collapse of the international rules-based order. We've got a rise in authoritarian aggression. We've got territorial invasion, obviously, in the case of Russia in Ukraine. We've got a rise in extremism around the world. And that includes the old extremism, which a lot of people think has gone away. Islamist-inspired extremism might just have moved its kind of geolocation, to North and West Africa, but it's still around. So the world is a generally pretty dangerous place. And that's before you factor in sort of non-military aspects as well, which I think, again, the article touches on, things like cybercrime, which is enormous at the moment, the third biggest economy, according to some of the experts, third biggest economy in the world at the moment with trillions of dollars. So cybercrime, what's known as grey zone warfare, which is below the threshold warfare the experts talk about, which includes things like election manipulation, sabotage, that kind of thing, disinformation. So I think generally speaking, the global landscape looks pretty much as precarious as it has done since the Cold War, or indeed even arguably since the Second World War.
And do you think that, well, I think I know the answer to this one. I think I know how to answer this question, but do you think the public grasp the scale of these threats? And do you think our politicians grasp the scale of these threats?
I'm not sure they possibly grasp it to the extent that they should, to be perfectly honest. And I'm only basing this on kind of anecdotal evidence. Sure. But I'm always quite surprised. I think there's a general awareness. It might not be quite as acute as the 1962 sort of Cuban Missile Crisis, where I am just old enough to remember that. But certainly I remember adults certainly being afraid and talking about things as though they were afraid. And there is an element of that. There's a whiff of that around, I think, at the moment. But I still feel anecdotally that we're not getting a realization amongst the general public of just how precarious the landscape is. I mean, we are perilously close to, if one thinks of that, the doomsday clock, as it's known, the nuclear clock. I mean, it's probably at its most extreme position than it's been, certainly since the Cold War. And again, I think the public don't get the extent of the threat simply because they see the threat in terms of mainly nuclear war or state actors involved here. They don't see that wider kind of jigsaw with all the pieces that make up the threat to global security.
George, when we started speaking about this series, you said that you wanted to talk about the word you used, the word which I quite liked, was the renaissance in Scottish shipbuilding. We're witnessing a renaissance in Scottish shipbuilding just now. I mean, what makes you say that? What's fueling that revival?
Well, I mean, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's certainly a good time to be talking about this because there is so much of it happening, in Scotland and the defence and shipbuilding landscape. But I framed it as a renaissance because the yards that govern Scotstoun and Rosyth are probably in the strongest position they've been in for decades. Between the Type 26 programme and the Type 31s at Norway, you're looking at what I think it could probably be described as one of the biggest surface warship build programmes in the world outside of the US and China, because I mean, let's face it, the Clyde and Rosyth are never going to compete with those kind of budgets, those kind of defence industrial bases. But I mean, add to that Norway's 10 billion order for the Type 26, supporting thousands of jobs. You can see the scale of the opportunity, the facilities in Scotland have ahead of them. And I think, I use this term quite a lot too, and I think it's a very common term when describing shipbuilding in Scotland, feast and famine. The big question now is sort of, how do we stop this becoming another boom and bust cycle? How do we avoid another feast and famine? I think three things need to line up. First, long-term procurement planning from the UK. I mean, that means mapping out replacements for ships like the Type 45, the air defence destroyers, and locking them in so that industry can plan decades ahead. There's a sort of lot of disquiet from industry just now. I've spoken to all the major primes in Scotland, and they're waiting for, and I love this term, a demand signal. They're waiting to see, this is what the Ministry of Defence want, this is when they want it. And the sort of problem recently has been communication. Now, obviously, with a new government come new priorities, but industry often expressed to me that they're waiting. They're twiddling their thumbs. They're just sitting waiting. They want to get started. But secondly, the Scottish Government needs to treat the defence industry as part of its own industrial strategy. I think a lot of listeners will be aware of the fact that defence industry to the Scottish Government seems like dirty words. It's not something they like to talk about. But they have a massive role to play. Now, obviously, defence has devolved, but supporting skills, creating a financial framework for civilian contracts, and making sure smaller yards like Ferguson's can get a slice of the work are all things well within their reach. And sort of thirdly, we need a mindset shift. Defence isn't, it's not just about military capability or big pointy grey ships being built on the Clyde. It's about industrial capability, and if we get that right, shipbuilding in Scotland can sustain the renaissance that I'm so keen to sort of talk about.
It's interesting. So I spoke to the Scottish Government yesterday, in fact 2 days ago, sorry, just about the series and just about the requests from the sector, the asks from the sector. And we got a comment back from Kate Forbes, the Deputy First Minister, and it was quite strong. I think it was probably one of the strongest comments in support of the sector I've seen from the SNP. She talked about the defence sector being fundamental to both our national security and a strategic driver for Scotland's economy. So it does feel like there's a bit of a shift there, George, is there?
I think so. I mean, it's worth noting that there was a relatively sort of recent policy U-turn, if you could call it that. Until very recently, Holyrood sort of had a ban on funding anything to do with what they would, term munitions. That, it hindered projects like there was a submarine welding facility to be built on the Clyde, which lost a 2.5 million, I think it was, pound grant under the old rule. Just this month, quite recently, in fact, John Swinney lifted that ban, saying that the international situation has changed. Their new approach does seem to be more flexible. Public support can go to defence projects, provided firms show they're not supplying regimes accused of genocide or war crimes. But, it's a big shift, and it does show that, I think in Scotland, defence is becoming more of a political issue than it otherwise has been recently. I think in Scotland, the public at large and the Scottish Government had a sort of complacency about defence. But I mean, geographically, we're right on the front line in the North Atlantic, and up until recently, you wouldn't know it from the political debate here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I spoke to one politician when we were planning this series, and they said to me, defence is now going to be a political issue. Defence will be on the ballot paper in the election next May. Is that something you think, David? Do you agree with that sort of that description?
I think there's a certain realpolitik kicking in here. I mean, people are waking up. Our politicians latterly of all stripe, I think, across the board, are waking up to the fact that this is a dangerous world in which we live. I sometimes think, though, just going back to a couple of remarks that George was making in that particular sector, particularly, warship building, which, we've got here in Scotland at the moment or whatever. But, we're having to rethink in so many levels here from a defence capacity. I mean, I spend a lot of time, as you know, Andrew, in Ukraine. Indeed, I'm going back next month. And one of the places I'll be visiting in this next trip is Mykolaiv, which ironically is twinned with the city of Glasgow. I don't know if you're aware of that. And they share a shipbuilding history, of course. And the famous warship, the Moskva, the Russian warship that was sank in the early days of the war in Ukraine by the Ukrainians. I mean, an absolute state of the art, huge warship, going up against a country that virtually had no real naval capacity, and it was sank. It was sank by maritime drones. And I think it was Robin McAlpine in his article in the series in the Herald during the week who rather disparagingly spoke about boys with their toys when he was talking about aircraft carriers, warships, the big beasts, if you like, of the defence industry. And then, while I agree to some extent with that, I think it is a bit off the cuff and disparaging and kind of denies the real world that we live in and the need for these big beasts in some way or another. But I think we've got to be acutely aware as well, as Ukraine has shown us, and indeed the experience of the Moskva has shown us, that the technology is changing so damn rapidly at the moment, that you can use a maritime drone to take out an enormous warship of that capacity. So, I think Scotland really, from an industrial perspective, an economic perspective, needs to be up to speed with that new technology. It's not just about the big beasts, important as they are in terms of jobs and the technology and whatever, but it's important to keep abreast of the new technology. And in some cases, Scotland is certainly punching above its weight there as well. But it's a vitally, vitally important sector in that sense. But one, I think, shifting so swiftly that there's a real challenge to keep on top of it, actually. No, I do think the politicians are waking up to it. I mean, it's they can't avoid it. I mean, burying your head in the sand is not an option right now. If I get politically frustrated with certain things, again, anecdotally, it's talking to people who kind of, I don't know, I've got this, particularly people of a pro-independence disposition in Scotland, who sometimes seem to think that by Scotland getting rid of its nukes, by Scotland being independent and not being part of, shall we say, the NATO alliance, or not having nuclear facilities birthed here in Scotland, that somehow we'll be safe from this global threat that actually exists. And in my opinion, it's cloud cuckoo land, really, with that kind of thinking. It's utterly, utterly naive in that way. So I think it's incumbent upon politicians not just to get the policies, I mean, the economics right of actually tapping into the sector, but also getting the politics right here and getting the right messages out to the public to let them understand the nature of this threat, and that you can't just by saying, hey, we're independent, we're a tiny wee nation, we're no threat to anyone, that somehow we won't get caught in the crosshairs here. That is incredibly naive. And I think politicians too are beginning to realise that. They're also beginning to realise, I think, the expediency of votes out of this, to some extent. Because burying your head in the sand is not going to be a vote winner for those that are joined up thinkers with regards to the defence debate in that way. I think for a long time, there was a tendency to kind of appease the peacemakers. That sounds a terrible thing to say, but appease the peacemakers in a way. But I think we're realising that the landscape has changed.
And David, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Ukraine has shaped how the defence industry is looking at. I mean, you mentioned like boys with their toys. That traditionally Britain has gone for a fleet of gold-plated large warships. But I think the thinking now from industry, particularly BAE on the Clyde, is sort of less conventional. The model being looked at now, maritime drones, they're everywhere. Germany are looking at this, most Western countries are looking at this, but BAE's proposal for the Type 45 replacement is effectively a moderate number of moderately capable larger motherships and smaller maritime drones escorting them. The first Sea Lord recently at DSEI in London promised that these new ships would be escorted by 2 or 3 sort of smaller drones. And I think we're sort of seeing a shift towards drones because of Ukraine. The sort of benefit that benefit of that to industry, which is my sort of area of focus, is that these smaller ships, these less complex ships, can be built. They can be built at Ferguson's. They can be built and assembled at smaller yards around the country. I suppose the point I'm making here is they can be built faster, they can be built cheaper, and crucially, if like the Moskva, if something does happen to them, no people are lost. And I suppose without ranting on here, as I'm sort of losing my train of thought on this, Ukraine has shaped a great deal of where the industry is now in Scotland. And more so, I think it's shaping how the industry looks around the world. As I mentioned, Germany, they're looking at a very similar idea of larger motherships, but with the missiles, the sensors on. I think it's sort of reminiscent of picket ships, from the past. Distributed effects. Yeah, I think I'm going to cut there because I'm sort of ranting and rabbiting on it at this point. But it's a sort of personal, passion of mine, the maritime drone side of things.
Sure. I mean, one of the things, Andrew, if I can just say, I mean, just more on a political level, I suppose, than anything else, is that, going back to the position of politicians and political parties and the Scottish government and whatever, and indeed the voters themselves, particularly those that are, say, pro-independence, I do believe that there is a kind of awakening happening here that some people actually do understand that, if you want to enhance, for example, Scotland's chances of gaining independence, let's say, right, then really you're going to have to get into bed with the big players here. I think you're shortchanging the independence cause. I think many politicians are seeing that by not realizing that Scotland will have to play its part alongside the big players there, really, and that by saying, oh, you're not having NATO here, or we're not having this here, or whatever, that may sound fantastically progressive and wonderful and a bit naive, but it actually, in some ways, is an impediment, I think, potentially, for Scotland making its case in terms of independence, because it will not be embraced by the European Union, its defence pacts, it will not be embraced by NATO in that way. So the politicians, I think, are having to wake up to playing a kind of canny game here in that way. Keeping, if you like, the voters on side and those that are very, very against any militarization as they see it, and at the same time keeping on board the geopolitics and the kinds of partners and allies that could potentially help Scotland's case towards independence. It's a tricky one, but it's one they're going to have to confront.
George, let me take you back to something else David was saying a wee bit earlier when he was talking about the industry, the sector in Scotland needing to get up to speed. You know this industry probably better than any other journalist in the country. I mean, do you feel that they are doing that? Are they getting up to speed? Are they able to be fit for the world that we're in just now?
I think so. I mean, I spent a lot of time recently on the Clyde at Rosyth, and the sort of big message being delivered by these defence primes is capacity. And there's a term in industry, there's a term in sort of ministerial communications that I think a lot of people despise because it's at pace. So they're looking to do things at pace, which I think for you and I and for most people it just means a little bit quicker than the already glacial pace they produce ships. I mean, the Type 26 is a good example of this. I think the steel was cut on the first one, gosh, what, 5-6 years ago? It's still, it's still not beyond sea trials. It's going very, very slowly. But the focus very recently has been throughput. So the Janet Harvey Hall, which opened recently on the Clyde, 2 frigates side by side. Rosyth has the Venture building, which does the exact same job. So both companies are now they're hiring, they're pushing, they're sort of looking at the defence industrial supply chain. In short, to answer your question, yes, capacity and speed of build is really the focus for these firms now. It's cutting the build time for a Type 26 or Type 31 down by years. Now that they're having a solid sort of drumbeat of work, efficiencies can be learned, lessons can be learned, and it's allowing for a sort of... I'm reluctant to use the word quicker here because I think, as everyone knows, these things, they do take a very long time, but it's certainly faster than it has been. And on capacity, Rosyth very much so has a lot of space. They're currently pursuing export orders for Denmark from Sweden. When I was there very recently, I asked, look, do you have space for this? Because with the Royal Navy orders, the yards are effectively at capacity. But the site isn't short of space to expand. I think they have plans for extra facilities to store, extra facilities to assemble. So the industry is stepping up, is what I'd say. They're investing a lot of their own money alongside taxpayers' money into meeting targets much faster and more efficiently, as much as a defence programme can be efficient.
So the industry is stepping up. David, we think the government is stepping up. We think voters are stepping up as well. You talked about these sort of awakenings. I think one of those awakenings maybe came this week with Donald Trump saying to NATO allies that if a Russian plane comes into your airspace, you should shoot it down. I mean, how close are we to that, do you think?
If you look at throughout the course of military and geopolitical history, conflagrations have often been started by mistakes or by people overstepping the mark or by miscalculations as much as by tactical and strategic sort of objectives and planning, So, anything can happen in that way. But speaking of anything can happen, I mean, anything Donald Trump says, of course, I think should be taken with a pinch of salt.
Yeah.
But I do think as I was writing in the Herald sister paper, the National, in my column today, there was one thing at least Trump said that I thought was actually on the nail, and that was the increasing irrelevance of the United Nations. I think there's an acute awareness that the UN at the moment is not really fit for purpose. It's not doing what it should be doing or what the charter originally set out to establish. I mean, I think Emmanuel Macron's speech made that quite clear at the General Assembly, that they have to step up to the plate. They have to get their act together here under tremendous threats. Now, of course, Trump is denouncing the UN, but he's as much part of the problem as he is a solution with cuts to the UN budgets. The United States, nothing new there. It's slow in getting its hands into its pockets when it comes to funding the UN or whatever. So, again, that kind of weakening, that erosion of the UN on a global platform, I think, is making for this increased dangerous world that we live in. We don't have the checks and balances there. And the more leaders like Donald Trump, theoretically the most powerful person in the world, coming from certainly militarily one of the most powerful countries in the world, the more these people are seen to ride roughshod over international rules-based orders or whatever, the more encouragement that gives to other players in different parts of the world, all of which is what I'm saying is feeding in to this precarious kind of position that we're in. I mean, I don't think at the moment we can stress enough just how dangerous things are. It would not take much just to tip things over the edge. I mean, we'll look at the breaches in airspace in Central and Eastern Europe lately by Russian aircraft. These things can go wrong in a nanosecond, and before we know where we are, we're in a very, very deep and dark place. So, being aware of that has never been more important at the moment. And having the defense capacity, I think, to, basically keep your back or watch your back is vital at the moment. And I repeat, that's why I think politicians and there's a genuine global awareness about how dangerous things are.
Honestly, I think David's 100% correct on this. Globally, I'd agree we are in the most volatile period probably since the Cold War. State-on-state conflict is back in Europe with Ukraine. China's challenging the sort of global order of things in the Indo-Pacific. The Arctic is opening up new competition, and the Middle East is unstable again. For the UK and especially for Scotland, sitting on NATO's northern flank, as NATO often likes to describe its borders, defence can't be a discretionary extra. It has to be central to a lot of public thought and primarily government thought.
I mean, I'm sure, Andrew, there will be people watching this podcast and saying, "Oh, these two are almost like boys with their own toys. They're almost, ramping up the militarization aspect." I wish to God it was otherwise. I wish to God we lived in a peaceful world. I wish to God we didn't have to consider these kinds of factors. I'm the last person, having spent 40 years of my life watching war up close. The last thing in the world I would ever advocate is any kind of militarized or over-militarized situation or an escalation in these situations. But it would be remiss of us and neglectful not to be aware of the dangers that we're facing. And I think a real dose of realpolitik has come to settle now, and it is percolating through, I think, to the general population. And I would like to think and hope that that the readers of the Herald series and those watching this podcast will get that message and will realise that it's not just about being alarmist. We're not advocating a militarization of the situation or encouraging an escalation. We're basically watching our back and being cautious and careful in what is a dangerous world.
David Pratt, the Herald's contributing editor on foreign affairs, and George Allison, the editor of the UK Defence Journal. That's it for this week. We'll be back again next week. Please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Tell your friends. Leave a review. And if you want to send us a question, you can just email politics@theherald.co.uk. Thanks very much for listening. Bye.